Well, thank you very much for coming to the session today. As Kelly mentioned in the introduction, this presentation is being made possible by a generous donation of the Fairport's Baptist Homes and the cooperation of the Macedon Library, who's providing the Zoom platform as well. And I want to thank them very much for funding today's program. Today's program is called Religion in the News. And for Penfield and Ocean and other organizations, I do quite a few talks on religious history. And I haven't really done any for the parenting folks. And Kelly and I thought this might be a good subject to kind of kick it off. And this is a topic that's not for everybody. So in case you don't like it, you could always turn it off and go watch Gunsmoke on MeTV, I guess. But hopefully you'll find it pretty interesting. This class is going to be given in 2 sessions, today and then next Wednesday, same time, same place, your living room. You can see part 2 of the class. So I know you're probably really sick to death of watching TV and seeing nothing but 24/7 coronavirus stuff. And I hate to tell you this, but I have to start off today's presentation talking a bit about coronavirus and how it's affected the religious landscape. But before I do, I should get out of the way all of the media coronavirus cliches that everyone is so used to. Okay, we're all in this together. This is a new normal. Stay healthy. And then the heroes, and more heroes. So now that we got that out of the way, let's start speaking about coronavirus and religion. We could start over in India. Now in India, it's quite an effect because a lot of Hindu religion is practiced in the temples, doing various rituals there. And you could see in this picture, there's a fellow trying to decontaminate a statue of a deity. It looks like Huna, who was a character in the famous Hindu epic Ramayana. And he was like the monkey king. And he's especially clever and intelligent. So if you have a knotty problem or something you can't solve, it's vexing, you would go give an offering to this particular deity. But because people touch the statues and do stuff, everything started out being very disinfected. And it was a big issue for the Hindu priest because part of their function every day, they have to take the statues and bathe them and dress them, and they're touching all of these statues. So then they got into a lot of precautions for this. But very shortly after this, they just closed all of the Hindu temples in India as the pandemic started breaking out there. And they told people to take all the normal offerings that you would give at the temple and instead give those to the poor and the needy in this time of this pandemic. Now, in India, there was a lot of controversy about a particular group, Tablighi Jamaat. And this was a missionary group for Sunni Islam. It's a worldwide missionary group, and they go around converting people to Sunni Islam. And they were quite active in India. And they were accused of being a super disease cell, that they were contaminating people. They were walking around. They had this kind of virus. And it got to the point where the leader of the group was actually charged by the Indian government with kind of a lower level of homicide in their law books. And then on top of that, all the different Muslim vegetable vendors, and many of them are vegetable vendors, came under attack because some legislators, prominent legislators in India, started accusing them of purposely infecting their vegetables with coronavirus saliva to infect the rest of society. And they announced there should be a big boycott of Muslim vendors. Now, if all of this is sounding a little fishy to you, it did to a lot of other people as well. If you look at India, it is about 80% Hindu, about 14% Muslim. And the 6% other is a wide cacophony of other religions, Christian, Jewish, Zoroastrian, Buddhist, Sikh, many other religions exist there. But as kind of a prominent minority, the Muslims have been coming under pressure, especially under the current regime that exists there in India, the regime of Prime Minister Modi. And he's held many rallies that are kind of based upon this Hindu first rally. You know, India is for the Hindus. And there has been a lot of discrimination against the Hindus in his tenure. And it got to a head last December, where they passed this thing called the Citizenship Amendment Act. And it made religion a criteria for nationality. So if you want to be a citizen in India, you have to be a Hindu, or you could be Zoroastrian, or you could be Buddhist, or you could be Jewish, or you could be Christian, or you could be Sikh. And guess what religion was missing? Islam, Muslims. Muslims were left off the list in terms of qualifying to be a citizen of Israel, of India. Of course, this was quite controversial, and many Hindus don't support this attitude as well. Here is a line of Hindus with protest signs, and they're protesting this Citizenship Act, how unfair it was to the Muslim community. What this is a picture of, actually, are a large number of Hindu men that are grooms going to their wedding. It's very expensive to have a wedding in the Hindu culture in India. It involves large dowries, a lot of gift giving, plus a fairly elaborate wedding. And it starts getting outside the finances of a normal person. So many social services agencies organize these mass weddings to try to take some of the financial burden off these families. And here's a bunch of grooms on the way to a mass wedding. And while they're going there, they're making their voice heard against this particular citizenship law. Let's move over to South Korea. And these are Buddhists having a large prayer session. And what you can see here is the representation of a tree, because Buddha attained enlightenment sitting underneath this Bodhi tree. So they kind of recreated this in a very artistic fashion out there. Now, the Buddhists did a lot of things where they were letting only one person at a time into their various temples to pray. And then finally, they had to shut down the temples entirely across Southeast Asia. Here's an example over in Sri Lanka. It's only open to the monks that reside at the temple. And this particular temple, actually, you see this in other Buddhist temples as well. These aren't monks, these are actually statues coming up. And they represent people being reincarnated into upper levels of enlightenment. And finally, when the monk reaches final level of enlightenment, he shows them in this blue color. And he's holding a lotus flower in his hand. And a lotus flower often symbolizes this enlightenment because it is this thing that comes out of the murky water and the muddy water of this beautiful flower. But the temples have been closed down where just the monks are allowed to reside in there because they live in the temples. And as you can see in this picture, they're attempting to do social distancing. And to make up for the fact that they're not allowing the populace into the temples, the monks are getting into technology. And you can see them here holding a prayer service over the internet where they're doing their chants and all of this other stuff and broadcasting it live. And actually, it has been extremely successful. And many of these monasteries are saying that, well, maybe this is the way we should do things. For example, in this particular monastery, one of the things they found out was that normally they get maybe 100 to 200 people coming to the temple for service. But since they've gone online, they're attracting 400 to 500 people to participate. So now the monks are investing in a lot of technology, and even after the pandemic's gone, they feel they should get into this virtual type of religion, Buddhist religion, for their clientele. Now, the issue with the pandemic is especially difficult for some of the Buddhist monks because many of them are kind of mendicant monks, where they go around and they beg for alms, and in return for that, they give some type of a blessing, or they'll get some kind of food donation. And you can see them here, and they're all wearing these masks, having to go out into the public. But very often what they've been doing with most of these donations is they've been giving it back to the population. And they've been organizing very large kind of meal support for the community. And it shows where they're feeding long lines of people that are coming in during the pandemic that can't get food. and they've been making meals in the kitchen over there in the Buddhist temple and handing them out. When it comes to feeding people and having meals, no one probably beats the Sikhs. That's a religion that's headquartered over in India, but they have presence all around the world. And you could see them here organized for a very large meal. I went to an interdenominational event that Nazareth College was hosting a couple of years back. I had speakers from various religions speaking there, and they had a Sikh speaker talking there. And I got into a conversation with him, after his session, and, he invited me to come over and visit the temple, the Sikh temple, local temple in Rochester. And I said, that'd be great. I'd like to see what your service is like. And he says, the service is going to be in this other language, and you're not going to understand all the recitations of this stuff. Why don't you instead come at this other time where we have like the meal? So I came over there, and I thought it would be this kind of like a mixer with maybe cheese and cracker and cookies. And it was this big, big meal. I mean, a serious meal that they serve. And it's a key element of the Sikh religion. When Guru Nanak, who was the founder of the religion, originating the religion, once his father sent him with some money, and he was supposed to go into town to invest it in a business. And instead, he saw some hungry people there. And he took the money and he cooked up a giant meal. And he fed all of these hungry people. And the father was very upset when he got home that he didn't invest the money in the business. And Guru Nanak stated in reply that anytime you do a good deed to help people, that is a worthy investment. And that has become a key part of the Sikh religion. A Sikh temple called the Gurdwara is always open 24 hours a day. They have a door on all four sides that's open, and they have a kitchen that runs 24/7, and anybody that wants can come in to the temple at any time of the day and be fed. And many homeless people come into the Sikh temples to get fed. The meal time is also a key part of their service. So they have the formal religious service, and then they have this communal meal called the langar, which is just as important as attending the service. And when Guru Nanak founded Sikhism, at the time, there was a lot of fighting going on between the Hindus and the Muslims in India. And he was trying to find some common ground. So he founded this new religion. He took some elements of Islam, elements of Hinduism, and some other things that he added to it to build it. But the foundation of the religion was this idea of equality. He wanted to get around all of these levels of hierarchy and classes that existed in Indian society. So this communal meal reflects all of this, the langar. So after the service, everybody kind of sits on the floor, or they could sit on, and there's no head table, there's no kind of rank. Everybody's expected to mix and mingle, not to kind of form any cliques, and everybody kind of gets fed this same meal. And it's considered a very, very important part of the Sikh religion. And when it comes to feeding people, and feeding large numbers of people in society, the homeless or whatever, nobody does it better than the Sikhs. They have high skills in making huge quantities of food that they use to feed people that come through their doors night and day. And they've been very active during the pandemic feeding people. For instance, if you look at the Sikh temple over here in Queens, they started organizing meals to feed the people and the homeless people in New York during the pandemic. And just to give you an idea of the scope, they served something like 30,000 meals out of this kitchen in just 2 days. And the social service agencies fight over each other to rush over to the Sikh temples to get these meals to hand out to their clientele, because the meals are made vegetarian. Because the idea is the Sikhs want anybody to be able to come into their temples to get a free meal, and they don't want to violate any religious norms. And usually, any kind of religious norms in diet, whether it be kosher for Jewish or halal for Islam, they involve meat. So if you have a vegetarian meal, you're quite safe in terms of it being acceptable to any religion. So that's why the social service agencies rush in there for these meals, because they know they could feed it to a lot of these special groups in their clientele, and they like the food and they'll eat it, and it's perfectly acceptable. So the Sikhs are out there trying to save the world one meal at a time, I guess. Let's take a look at Islam. In the largest Islamic country in the world, which doesn't exist in the Middle East, it exists over in Southeast Asia, Indonesia. And this is quite a large mosque there. They're not 6 feet apart, they're actually a meter apart, 3 feet apart. And you can see this huge mosque, and everyone's facing this particular niche in the mosque. It's called a mihrab. And this is what faces Mecca. So everybody knows where to face. And you can see all of these people in the mosque trying to social distance. And this epidemic broke out right in the period where they're doing the Hajj. These people are traveling to Mecca to do this pilgrimage. And most people are familiar with this Kaaba, this large obelisk that people do all the circling, and you could see that these teams are there trying to disinfect things while all of this is going on. But this didn't last very long. Very shortly after the pandemic broke out, they basically called it off. And they emptied the Grand Mosque, and they said, you know, there will be no Hajj going on. And they changed the call to prayer in all of the Muslim countries to stop people from coming to all of the mosques. So the call to prayer usually has a line in it that says, come to prayer, come to salvation. The edict went out that the prayer is now changed, that they should now say, pray in your homes. You know, I showed that picture of the Kaaba, and most people have seen that. It's very ancient. It predates Islam by at least 1,000 years. The ancient legend is that the initial walls of this edifice were constructed by Abraham and his son. But it was an ancient kind of a structure that held many different types of idols through the generations and the millennia. And when the story is when Muhammad returned to Mecca, in triumphant return, one of the first things he did was he went into the Kaaba and threw out all of the foreign idols. With one exception, he left a tapestry there that was there of Jesus Christ and the Virgin Mary. But you look at that and you say to myself, wow, look at that huge thing. But people really don't have an idea of what the scope is of the Grand Mosque there in Mecca. So you see that area right there with that big black Kaaba, giant thing? Well, this is what it looks like if you pull the camera back. See that teeny little black dot there? That's what we're looking at is the Kaaba. And this is the magnitude and size of that Grand Mosque in Mecca. You can see they're even expanding it to make it even larger. This is the largest clock face that exists in the world. So when people are in Mecca doing the Hajj, they can kind of look up and see what time it is to know where they have to be for different types of things. But the Grand Mosque complex is just incredibly huge. Well, while we're in the Middle East, let's go down the road and take a look over in Israel. And this is a synagogue over in Tel Aviv. And the people dressed in white are 2 Israeli policemen. And the synagogues, by state order, were all ordered to be closed. It had a big issue with the Orthodox, ultra-Orthodox groups in Israel violating those particular edicts. As a matter of fact, in Israel, they've had an issue that the ultra-Orthodox are about 10% of the population, but they account for about 50% of the total hospitalizations there in Israel. It's been a major problem. It's been an issue in some other countries as well. But finally, the Orthodox leaders have been getting people in line. It's taking a while. Here's an example of an issue they had in New York City. This was in April. They had a large Hasidic funeral. There are people wearing masks, but they're still not doing social distancing. But the different rabbis have finally got people to participate in this and get some social distancing going. So they need to start wearing masks a little bit more frequently. And there is an issue still in New York City that, the largest single group with infection is this Hasidic community that they have. Though that's not an issue outside of that with the other different denominations in Judaism in terms of the Reform and the conservative sects. And even within the Hasidic community, they're getting on board with all the social distancing, and many of the Hasidic Jews have been the primary people that have been signing up to be plasma donors. And the largest numbers of plasma donors, people who have been infected, have generally been Hasidic Jews over in New York City. And as I mentioned, the other Jewish denominations have been cooperating a lot with this. They've been holding virtual Passover seders that have occurred in this period. And here's a rabbi demonstrating, how to tune into a seder, virtual seder to this person. And this on the screen here, it's a young boy dressed up as Elijah. There's a section when they have the Passover seder where they read these different things, and there's a section where someone opens the door for the unknown guest, who is Elijah, who enters to usher in the era of the advent of the Messiah. So here's a young boy dressed up as Elijah coming through the door at this particular seder. We go across the globe, way to the other side, and we look over at South Korea. You could see them trying to disinfect the temples there. But the concern in South Korea wasn't really with the Buddhist temples. It was actually with the Christian churches. Not many people are aware of this, but the largest Christian churches that exist in the world exist in South Korea. There are churches in South Korea that they have 50 to 60,000 parishioners in their particular church, in one church. And they have these massive church halls that they hold maybe 7, 8, 9, 10 services a day, filing people in and out. And there were some issues getting them to cooperate with this pandemic, and people were highly concerned, but they did get them on board, and they were able to empty out these particular large Christian churches. Here it shows a series of ushers. They're the only people remaining in the church for a service. If we look at another form of Christianity that's not really spoken about very much, the Coptic Christians, who exist over in Ethiopia, one of the oldest branches of Christianity. This is a large Coptic church that's there. And they didn't want people inside the church because they thought it would be too crowded. So instead, they've set up this massive outdoor service. And they've got everybody spaced at these intervals, and they've got the priest running their service over here in the center. While we're on the subject of Orthodox Christianity, you could see over here in Moscow a very large Russian Orthodox church. Need a second for it to come up. And they're televising the services. The church is empty. So they went to televise services to empty out the churches. If you notice here, you don't see any kind of pews, which is very typical of many of the Christian Eastern Orthodox services. Most of those churches don't have pews. People stand throughout the entire service. So that's one of the things you'll recognize in an Eastern Orthodox church. You'll walk in and people say, "Were there pews?" And there never were any. But there have been some issues, especially over in Moscow. They have a patriarch there, Patriarch Kirill. The Russian Orthodox Church was one of the last Orthodox churches to be founded. There's like about 7 of them. There's the Armenian, and there's the Coptic, and there's the Syrian, and there's Ukrainian, the Greek Orthodox. And the one that was founded in Russia, there's an interesting story around it. I don't know if it's true or not, but it was founded by Peter the Great, that thought when he was founding his empire, he needed a religion to unify the people. So he more or less auditioned these various religions. So he looked at the Judaic faith, and he highly respected their scholarship, but he thought they got discriminated and pushed around too much. And then he was looking at the Western Christianity, and he liked that with the pageantry, but he didn't like the idea of a pope, people taking orders from a pope. He wanted people to take orders from him. And then he looked at Islam, and he saw their diet restrictions against certain types of meat, and he liked his meat, so he didn't like that. So he settled on this Eastern Orthodoxy, and he made that the official religion. And many people have accused the Russian Orthodox of, throughout their history, of kind of being under the thumb of the Russian state. But it's caused a lot of friction lately. This Krill guy has been pushing back against Putin and other people that he feels they're getting just too heavy-handed with the Russian church there in Russia today. If we look at Western Christianity, Catholicism, here's a basilica over in Washington, D.C., where they started to try to do some social distancing, but it was difficult to implement. They had in Manila, for example, they had Ash Wednesday, where they're supposed to take ashes and touch each person's forehead. So they modified the procedures, and instead they're sprinkling the ashes on each person's head as they go through the line, so there's no contact. And they started modifying communion practices, where it's kind of a drive-in thing, and you hold out your hand, and the priest drops the communion wafer into your hand. And pretty soon they went virtual, much as we saw the Buddhists did and other people did. There's an example in Los Angeles where they generally have a big rosary service, and instead they're broadcasting this live in an empty church. But they've tried to do other innovative things. There's a fellow over in Rhode Island, a priest, decided to set up in the doorway of his church, and then everybody's out there in the parking lot, and he's basically running the service while everyone's in their parked cars. And some Protestants over in Kentucky thought they could do that even one better, and they said, rather than a parking lot, why don't we go to a drive-in theater? We'll set up a large drive-in theater there. And the authorities weren't crazy about this, and there's a big fight about it as well with the governor. And people have even pushed to do outdoor services and over here in Alaska. Now, you think we've had a late spring. You should check out Alaska. Now, this isn't quite that bad. This was like towards the very end of March. But here's a fellow standing on top of a snowdrift trying to hold an outdoor service to follow the social distancing guidelines there. Actually, in Christianity, there's a lot of things that have cropped up on the internet that actually there is this Saint Corona. And they've said that she's actually the patron saint of pandemics. And she just happens to be buried in this chapel in northern Italy, which is one of the big centers of the pandemic. And this sounds just too odd to be true, and it's truly not. Saint Corona exists. She's usually paired with somebody called Saint Victor. And the story goes on these two particular saints that Saint Victor, or Victor, was being forced to renounce his Christianity, and he refused to do so. So some soldiers there were doing some horrible torture to him, and Corona came over to comfort this particular person they were torturing. So they took Corona, the Roman soldiers, and they tied her between two palm trees, and they stretched the palm trees down, and then they cut the rope, and boom, Saint Corona did a pretty gory end, as most saints do when they get martyred. So she's generally pictured in some way between two palm trees. She's actually the saint historically of gambling and treasure hunting. So if you lose something and you can't find it, you usually say a prayer to Saint Corona that you could find it. And rather than being a patron saint of Italy, she's generally more a saint in Austria and Eastern Bavaria, where she's kind of popular. The stay-at-home orders have caused a lot of controversy in different religions, especially here in the United States. You may have seen on the news this particular fellow, Pastor Rodney Howard Brown, who kept holding these services despite the authorities warning him to stop doing it. And he had this quote that we're raising up revivalists and not pansies, and he's not going to stop his congregation from meeting. And this is actually a mugshot where he finally got arrested. Actually, he's been known for doing a lot of publicity-seeking type things. Oh, he did a big thing with Trump a couple of years ago where he wanted to lay hands on him and all of this other type of stuff. There's another fellow over in Virginia who headed this New Deliverance evangelistic church. Bishop Gerald Green, which they couldn't shut him down either. He kept saying, God is larger than this dreaded virus. And unfortunately, he wound up dying of coronavirus. And then this other fellow who got national attention as well, his name was Landon Spraden. And he was a pastor in a charismatic Christian sect where they were very big on kind of laying the hands and healing. And he insisted on going around holding these healing sessions, especially doing Mardi Gras in New Orleans, saying that God can heal anything. And he came down with coronavirus. And there was a big national movement among the charismatics to have this national prayer movement going to heal him from coronavirus. And everybody expected him to be healed among the charismatic Christians, but he died and he passed away. And it caused quite some issues. Now, it's interesting because many religious scholars have been studying this area very closely with the charismatic Christians who tend to heal by laying on of hands. One of the persons that's studying this is a fellow by the name of Leonard, who's at the Wake Forest School of Divinity. And he's been following this case of this particular pastor in particular, and all of these people praying across the nation. And one of the things he's written about it is supernatural acts of healing are central to Christianity, from the gospel accounts of Jesus restoring the blind and lame, to the cures attributed by the Catholic Church, to the intercession of saints. Almost all Christian congregations pray for the sick. What distinguishes many charismatic Christians is their belief that such miracles are not extraordinary but routine. Those believers see faith healing as a practical measure to combat pain or illness, sometimes carried out by laying hands on the unwell or anointing them with oil. A deadly contagion like the coronavirus poses special challenges to these such convictions. By making these claims, you tend to overpromise in God's name, and that can be daunting to the faithful. So he's been studying the effect that they've been having this coronavirus, and they've been having these prayer sessions, and these people aren't recovering, and what effect it's having on these particular religious denominations. Now, since there has been this issue with healing people by laying of hands that have coronavirus, and have been some notable failures in the area, there's been some response by other charismatic Christians. And this particular fellow, who's a very popular preacher by the name of John Piper, came out with a book called Coronavirus and Christ. And in the book, he kind of justifies these people dying, even though they're having laying of hands, by saying some people will be infected with the coronavirus as a specific judgment from God because of their sinful attitudes and actions, that they're being singled out to be punished by God. And he's come under heavy criticism for coming out with this particular book. The son of the famous Jerry Falwell Jr., has also been in the news quite a bit. He heads up one of the largest Christian colleges in the United States called Liberty University. And where all the universities were shutting down, he thought that this was an overreaction, and he reopened his Liberty University right after spring break. And probably 60 students were infected and wound up, a couple died, and there were some lawsuits. And then he later claimed that the virus was the work of China to discredit President Trump. Now, all this is kind of interesting, because if we go back in history, there was a very famous preacher by the name of Billy Sunday. He was a famous baseball player. And as a baseball player, he converted himself into this very active preacher. And he would do these dramatic things on stage where he'd run across the stage and slide into home base. Say that he's, sliding safe to save their souls, and do all of these types of things. And he had his preaching during the Spanish flu epidemic. And he is seen as one of the key people that caused and initiated the second wave of the Spanish flu. He started holding a series of revivals over in Rhode Island, and they shut him down, and he went to another city and just held another revival, and they would hold 10 to 20,000 people in these revivals. And sure enough, like 6,000 people got infected and 1,000 died. And they saw that as the kickstart, as the second wave of the Spanish flu, which wound up killing more people than the first wave. And the interesting thing is, he came out with this idea of preaching that Germany was to blame for the Spanish flu. One of his quotes from one of his sermons was, "The Spanish flu started over there in Spain, where the Germans scattered germs around. There's nothing short of hell that they haven't stopped to do since the war began, darn their hides," because the Spanish flu took place during World War I. So here we have all of this flu being propagated by these churches who don't want to close, these pastors don't want to cooperate, and today they're blaming China. Back then they were blaming Germany for spreading and being the bad guy for the flu. So you say, well, you know, we're much more with it today. There's no reason to allow these large church gatherings in the United States that could kick off a huge wave of epidemic like happened over here in Rhode Island. We could just shut that down. Well, you would think that would be the case. But if you look at a map of the United States and you look at the states that have forbid religious gatherings, there's only 4 states. Washington, Virginia, Maryland, and over in Rhode Island, because they learned their lesson from the Billy Sunday. If you look at the map of what's actually going down around with these stay-at-home orders, if you look at the green states, those are people that have stay-at-home orders, but they exempted the churches from them. And with the little hash mark, they exempted the churches, but they put some qualifications that encourage them to not have too many people in their church. And the ones in the gray are people that when they wrote the legal stay-at-home orders, they just made it very vague in terms of what religious institutions were supposed to be doing. And these hatched ones are ones that they just left it up to the local city government to decide what the churches want to do. And then the white areas are ones that have absolutely no restrictions on the churches. And this purple place area here in Kansas, that's one that's in dispute. And one of the reasons that these legislatures haven't followed through to ban the churches from having services is an issue like they have in Kansas. This was written a few weeks ago. With Easter looming, Kansas Republican leaders on Wednesday revoked Democratic Governor Laura Kelly's order limiting religious gatherings to 10 people as the state's coronavirus jumped to 40%. So why is everyone gun shy about closing down these churches? Well, it goes back to large political movements that were happening not that long ago. I don't know if people could remember in the news, they talked about the war on Christmas, that there were many conservative Christian groups complaining that Christians were being persecuted. You know, people going around saying happy holidays rather than Merry Christmas. And people saying, well, alongside the crush scene, they had to show other religions and such like this. And there was a big campaign on this. So it's kind of this scab that was there that didn't heal, and it got scratched again. And people have said, well, this is just turning out to be like a war on Easter. People are saying they're taking the Easter holiday away, and there was this big reaction again. And of course, it's not only been something among lobbying the legislators and politicians, it has hit the courts. And there's been a large number of lawsuits. Lawsuits challenging Minnesota's partial shutdown, Virginia, defending lawsuits, Oregon's suing the governor. And you ask yourself, well, this is going to be an issue for the courts. Is this going to wind up going up to the Supreme Court? And they'll go back to the legislators and kind of hash all of this stuff out. Well, what many religious observers are saying, that the truth is it's going to be neither. That there's a third party that's entered into this fray, and they're quietly settling this issue all by themselves. And those people are the insurance companies. Did you ever look at your insurance policy in the fine print? There's usually some words in there that says, if there's a state of emergency and you go out and drive your car when you're not supposed to drive your car and get into an accident, you're not covered. Or if you violate the state of emergency, you're not covered. So the insurance companies have been going around to the churches, letting them know that if they violate these stay-at-home orders, that kind of falls under the state of emergency clause in their policies. So if somebody gets sick and dies in their churches, then they sue them. they're not going to be covered for liability. And if somebody burns down their churches because they're mad about that, they're not going to pay for their casualty insurance. And then all of a sudden, many of these churches now are seeing the light and getting religion and closing their churches down because they're worried about their lack of insurance. Let's take a look where the pandemic was especially bad over in Italy. Italy had this kind of perfect storm of things that came together that made the fatality rate so strong there from the disease. Many people in Italy live in apartments in very large extended families, where they have a family and they may have a brother and sister living there, plus the parents and the grandparents all in one apartment. So there's a lot of opportunity for contagion of younger people to older people. Plus the fact that social distancing is very, very close normally in Italy. I mean, many people who go to the Mediterranean, to these countries, they feel uncomfortable because people seem to stand very close to them when they speak. So a long social distance, could be like 2 feet as opposed to 6 feet. Plus the fact that in Italy, especially, people tend to disregard a lot of government regulations. People that have driven there have said, well, the Italians don't seem to follow any kind of traffic laws. So there's almost a cultural thing not to follow regulations. So they had a very difficult time getting people on board with all of this stuff. And even in late February, if you could see, there's a picture of the Pope. People were having very close contact, but things started to close down quite quickly. And the Pope Francis was actually one of the leaders in encouraging this. You see him staying up in his papal apartment there. And pretty soon, he was not addressing the people live. He would only be out in the square where people were supposed to socially distance and be on a video monitor. And then they shut that down as well. And they emptied out the Vatican totally to any kind of visitors or anybody coming there for service. The Vatican actually now is being used as a large homeless shelter. Pope Francis opened it up to all of these homeless people that are there. They have no place to go in the pandemic. And he's kind of feeding and sheltering them there in the Vatican. Now, Pope Francis has had a tough time the last 6 months or last year or so. If you could look and see at his popularity ratings on this chart, I mean, he was quite popular. I mean, his popularity was right up there, and then it took a nosedive. And that was when the sex abuse claims started surfacing, and his popularity dropped dramatically. And his unfavorability ratings started going up. And it got quite bad. I mean, here's a bad day for the Pope. He's in his own backyard in South America. And because of the controversy on the sex abuse crisis there, here's somebody's throwing, I think there's like a big wet mop or something on the side of his head. He got hit, that somebody in the crowd threw that at him. And then he had another bad day for the Pope. This was in the news quite a bit, where there was a group of onlookers there, and you could see some sequence that he was there, and some woman grabbed his arm and pulled him back, and he wound up slapping the woman's arm to let him go and kind of stalked off. And the press had a field day with this, talking about how the Pope slapped this woman. And what's interesting about it is expecting the Pope to issue an apology, but everybody was expecting one of these non-apology apologies that we're so used to from celebrities and politicians. And we've heard these so often, it's almost become the norm to the way people apologize now. That some famous person will get up and say, I'm sorry if I made you feel, right? I'm sorry, but you hurt my hand. I deeply regret the situation. Right? I apologize if I've unintentionally harmed you. Mistakes were made in my encounter with you. But he did none of those. No, instead, what he did is said publicly and then privately to the woman, made an apology. We lose our patience many times, Francis confessed. It happens to me too. I apologize for the bad example given yesterday. And many people, psychologists and other people across the world were surprised and very happy with the way he apologized, saying this is the proper way that people should apologize. And even some of his harshest critics gave him some kudos for this. when you look at the Pope, many people have this idea that he's at like the top of this big hierarchy. And it's true for running the Holy See, like this country, the state of the Vatican, because he's actually a monarch there. So he doesn't do a lot of administration stuff. But people think this is true for how he runs all of the Catholics around the world. And this is not true at all. It's not true. People have the impression somehow that he could just go over and write some papal bull or an edict, and all of a sudden, boom, that's what all the Catholics do. And the reality is, it's kind of set up like a power sharing or balance of power type of thing in terms of running the Catholics worldwide, where you have the Pope Francis and you have something called the College of Cardinals. It's like a big legislative body, and it's to vote on things. And then you have something called the Vatican Curia. And that is kind of like the civil service end of the Catholic Church. It's all of these administrators that kind of run things. And people in the Curia and then people in the College of Cardinals, they're there for kind of like life. It's not like he could fire a cardinal unless they do something really bad, or anybody in this Vatican Curia. I mean, they're kind of like these lifetime appointments. So he doesn't quite have the power that people think he has. So if you look, like one of the things that was on his agenda was getting everybody in line to social distance and follow the authorities for the coronavirus. So one of the things that he made his initial campaign was offering up funding and help for a lot of different vulnerable refugee populations, because he saw those as sitting targets for the coronavirus and people weren't doing anything to protect them. But he got pushback from all the different bishops and cardinals in the country saying, well, these people were not Catholic, they were some other religion, they could have been Protestant or Muslim, why are we servicing them? The Pope had a difficult time getting them to cooperate. He's trying to get everyone distance, where he's holding an Easter Mass and doing it virtually. Yet, he has this dissension at the same time, where he has a petition signed by 4 cardinals and an archbishop claiming that coronavirus is an overhyped pretext to deprive the faithful of Mass. And very prominent cardinals, like Cardinal Burke in the United States, saying that the faithful should attend Mass despite the coronavirus, directly contradicting what the Pope was trying to do. And then there was big criticism of the Pope in many circles. And they were saying, well, look at the Vatican. And they were pointing out there were long lines of cars waiting to get into the Vatican. And he was saying the Pope is a hypocrite, that he's telling people to stay home, yet he's ordering all the Vatican workers still to come to work in the Vatican. But then it came to light that these people weren't really coming to work in the Vatican. What they were doing is all of the different supermarkets and grocery stores were out of food in Rome there. And it turns out there is a supermarket just in the Vatican there, and they had food. So all these people are actually lined up to come into the Vatican, not to work, but to go and get food at this particular supermarket. But it didn't stop heavy criticism at the drop of a hat of Pope Francis. Another thing on his agenda was this frugality. You know, he started right off the bat criticizing many of the cardinals and bishops for their high living lifestyles. He said they just live too extravagantly. And he tried to set an example himself where, you know, he does not live in what's called the Papal Palace. He lives in a small kind of modest apartment. He just opened this up to visitors. And he dresses himself in plain type of vestments, where he's retired the Popemobile, instead drives around in this little economy Fiat. And then there was an incident too not long ago where they caught him in a local pharmacy. And he was over there buying himself a pair of orthopedic shoes, very cheap orthopedic shoes. And it shows him there wearing these particular shoes. But lo and behold, what appears is there was a thing that appeared in all of these European papers that Rolls-Royce was having this special audience with the Pope. And they said, if you made a donation of, I think it was like about $125,000, you could attend a private Mass with the Pope, and we'll ferry you there in a Rolls-Royce and put you up at these nice hotels. And people are wondering, where did this come from? I mean, this is totally against, you know, what Pope Francis says. And it disappeared, but they suspect that someone kind of did this behind the Pope's back in the Curia, just to kind of make him look bad. So you say to yourself, what's going on here? And then another example would be climate change. That was part of his agenda. And so he had an interview where he stated that this pandemic could be nature's response to climate change. And he was mocked and pilloried for making such an outrageous, crazy statement. But scientists have been investigating this very thing and saying many similar types of things. Because what scientists have been investigating is that many of these weird outbreaks we've been having, whether it's Ebola or SARS or AIDS, have been coming from different animals in the animal kingdoms that have been developing that and have been mutating it. And they're trying to establish any kind of links between changes in these animals' environments and then the cropping up of these mutations. And they're wondering if climate change could be somehow linked to this influx of some of these diseases we're saying that are migrating over from the population. But the Pope got really pilloried for this as well, making this observation that many scientists did. There was an issue that he wanted with communion for divorced couples. What happened after he came out with this edict? Immediately, there was another document that got put out by 4 conservative cardinals challenging the Holy Father about his cautious opening, allowing communion for divorced and remarried couples in 2016. So you say to yourself, what's going on here? Why is he getting so much flack from the College of Cardinals and this Vatican curia? Well, he's kind of out there as a pope. I was watching a TV special the other day on Pope Francis, and some Vatican journalists, described him and said, he's not a liberal pope and he's not a conservative pope. He's kind of a radical pope. So he's going to push stuff the wrong way, but it still seems extreme in terms of people pushing back on his behavior within his own church. And what many Vatican observers say is going on is there's actually an issue because there's a 4th party in there that's actually causing the opposition. And that 4th party in this circle is none other than the previous Pope, Pope Benedict, who's now called Pope Emeritus Benedict. When the Pope Benedict retired, he did not go off back to Germany sipping beer in some beer hall in Bavaria. Instead, he stayed right at the Vatican. Matter of fact, he has an office right at the Vatican, his apartment right there at the Vatican. And it's kind of similar to a situation that if you had, Trump in the White House and Obama never moved out of the White House. He stayed there and had an office in the West Wing. And when people talk to Trump, if they don't like what he says, they could walk over and talk to Obama. But instead, you have this situation and then the former Pope there. And many Vatican observers feel that a lot of this pushback is being orchestrated by the former Pope, who was much more conservative than Pope Francis. Some really explicit examples were one of the things on Pope Francis' agenda was allowing priests to marry. Now, there was an incident over in the Amazon, and that's his backyard, he knows well, where there's such a shortage of priests that the only way to meet the demand is to have married priests. And he wanted to do an experiment there and have married priests. And this was kind of going along, and he was ready to set this up and kind of do this as kind of a vanguard to see how it would go. And right in the middle of this, he had to put all the brakes on because all of a sudden, this book came out of no place. Benedict co-authored a book with another cardinal who's been a critic of Francis, called From the Depths of Our Hearts, Priesthood, Celibacy, and the Crisis of the Catholic Church. And in this book, a major part of it is reaffirming the necessity of priestly celibacy, that priests should not be allowed to marry. And this caused a whole bunch of controversy right in the middle of him planning to do this pilot in the Amazon, and he had to call it off. The other thing that has been on his agenda was this idea of approving women deacons. He had a series of nuns approach him in the United States asking for this, and he said, okay, he'll look into it. And some people feel that he's going to use this as an entree to maybe allow women priests as well. So what he did was he said, well, let's do this. Let's look at the historic precedent. Now, he knows from his Vatican historians that have met with him saying that, if you want to base it on historic precedent, it's a slam dunk. because there's plenty of historic precedent that there were these early women deacons in the Christian church. So he appointed a commission, to confirm and lay out this evidence of this historic precedent. And then also to kind of firm things up and get his ducks in a row, he went across over to the Eastern Orthodox people. And he said to them, something, I'm thinking about, instituting these women deacons, and maybe you should get on board with this. They said, hey, good idea. So they jumped the gun and they got women deacons. So theologians from US and Greece voiced support for the decision of the Patriarch Theodosius of the Greek Orthodox to restore the female deaconate. So he thought he's moving right along there, and then all of a sudden, out of no place, boom, this commission that he had all of a sudden said they're not going to make a judgment and they're not going to get back to Pope Francis. It seemed like a series of people on the commission suddenly changed their votes and suddenly said, we don't believe any of the evidence, historic evidence, that there ever were women deacons. We don't accept any of it, out of no place. And some people kind of smelled a rat. And some people think maybe the rat was former Pope Benedict, was known as Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger before he became the Pope. Because when he was a cardinal back in 1997, the International Theological Commission voted to approve women deacons in a paper that he was a president of at his time. And then when he saw this paper, he buried it. He refused to release it and he refused to make it public. So people suspect that he was behind this sudden changing of this commission. But the Pope has been fighting back. He's getting his mojo back. So he said, well, I'm going to fire the old commission and I'm going to completely replace this all-male commission with a new commission. And on the new commission, I'm going to put 5 men and 5 women and see what they have to say about this. And he's also taken some other steps. If you remember in your history books, there was this thing about FDR and the idea that the Supreme Court was voting down all of his New Deal proposals. So he was going to pack the Supreme Court, see if he could increase the number of justices to dilute their power. So Pope Francis has looked at this and says, wow, this is kind of interesting. I mean, normally we have 121 cardinals. What if we kind of push the number up a little bit? So he's been kind of exceeding that number with appointments. And then the other thing he's done is he said, well, maybe we should change the representation. The way cardinals worked in the past, it was more like the House of Representatives, whereas based on population. So if you're in a state that had a big population like California or Texas or New York, you have a lot of representatives, right? Or you have a lot of cardinals. The Senate is different. You could be from a small state like Rhode Island and have just as many senators as a big state like Texas. And he's saying, let's make the College of Cardinals more like the Senate than the House. So he started appointing cardinals from all of these small countries that had very small Catholic populations but weren't represented. Things like Pakistan and such. So he's kind of rewriting the College of Cardinals doing this. So he's created 88 cardinals from 56 countries, 17 of which have never been represented in the College of Cardinals. It's causing a big controversy because people over in big Catholic countries like Spain or whatever are saying, look at, my city has more Catholics than Pakistan, and we don't have a cardinal, you're giving them a cardinal. So now the European cardinals who once dominated only represent about 37% of the cardinals. And now he has about 52% of the cardinals, or people that he appointed. So he's hoping to get an easier go for some of his policies by changing the makeup of this conservative bunch of cardinal, College of Cardinals. Another thing you've seen in the news recently, locally, regarding the Catholic Church, has been them filing for Chapter 11 reorganization. And there's been a lot of controversy about this because there's all of these lawsuits that are coming up. And the lawyers are calling foul and saying the Catholic Church is doing this to hide themselves from the lawsuits. And just a week or so ago, there has been a judge that set aside the legal claims until the bankruptcy filing has gotten sorted out, and also because of the coronavirus. But people have made observations and said it's not quite what it seems with this filing of the bankruptcy to protect themselves. And that's because there's been three big pressures financially on the Catholic Church regarding infrastructure, attendance, and these elderly priests and nuns. If you look at their infrastructure, they are saddled with many, many, many aging, costly buildings. They're extremely expensive to repair and maintain. Maintain the roofs, the windows, the stonework, the air conditioning, and the heating. I mean, this is the church that was kind of, you see at the entrance of Cornhill. I mean, just to repair this section of the roof, to reshingle, it cost over like $100,000. So they're very costly even to just heat and to light and to make things more complicated. Many of these have been designated historic landmarks, which makes them even more expensive to upkeep and repair. So this is a huge capital burden around many of the dioceses to maintain these buildings. Plus, the church attendance has been resuming a downward slide. You could see here, this line, our Protestant church attendance, percentage of people attending, fairly flat, right? But if you look at the Catholic Church attendance, it's plummeting down from 75%, plummeting down here to 39%. And what's even more troubling is you're seeing that downward trend among older Catholics. You know, traditionally, the way it works in religions, actually all around the world, is that the older people get, the more they get kind of religion and the more they participate in a religion. So you see more older generation people going to mosques and temples and to churches. Well, what you see in the Catholic Church is you see not only young people here dropping off in attendance, but you see older people as well, significantly dropping off into attendance. And this has caused big financial burdens in terms of any kind of donation money coming into the church. Plus, you're saddled with the cost of the elderly priests and nuns. The average age of priests in the United States used to be 35 back in 1970. It's up to 63 now. And most of them don't have 401ks, very few pensions, Social Security. So they have very few resources in their retirement that the church has to finance. Now, the religious sisters that work as nuns and teachers, many of them weren't compensated for their work or weren't paid anywhere near what the lay people were paid in parallel jobs. And so most of them are only collecting about a third of what a typical teacher or nurse would get for Social Security. A recent actuarial study showed that basically if they wanted to fund these people like they probably should be funded, they would need like $4 billion. And they're only adding maybe about $28 million annually to this type of retirement fund. So what a lot of accountants have pointed out was the Catholic Church was well on its way to bankruptcy. That even if you did not have all of these lawsuits that were going to occurring, it was going to declare bankruptcy in a fairly short order. So this was kind of like a little straw that kind of pushed things over the top, as opposed to the reason that they needed to declare bankruptcy. Well, let me finish up with another couple of quick things. Muslim women in the Middle East have been exerting much more of their rights. Little things that you don't think are big deals, but important to them. For example, celebrating Valentine's Day. It was put down by many of the clerics in the Middle East as kind of a sacrilegious heathen holiday, but it's being ignored, and many of the Muslim women are now participating in Valentine's Day. And also, they've been changing their style of dress. There's a segment of the fashion industry, clothing industry, that's called modest fashion. And it's the section that caters to Muslim women and others who want to dress in more modest dress. And it's a huge segment of the garment industry. It accounts for about $44 billion in sale in 2015. And they have very high-level designers across the world that design these different types of dresses for this modest fashion industry. As a matter of fact, if you look at haute couture, when you think of these fashion runways over in France, the majority of haute couture today is actually high fashion for the modest fashion segment. Reuters reported that women from the Middle East have become the world's largest buyers of high fashion. They're looking for custom-made outfits with very intricate embroidery and sewing and all of this. And when they meet among themselves and don't have men present, they aren't restricted to this garb, and they'll wear very high fashion Western garb. Another holiday that's taken recently, and this happened before, fortunately, the pandemic, was the Hindu festival of Holi. Sometimes they call this the Festival of Colors, but it's actually a spring festival. And the colors actually represent different types of things in terms of good conquering evil. The blue stands for perseverance over evil. The red stands for love. It stands for your heart, to love people over evil. And these colors represent having these attributes to conquer evil and good and promote goodness as spring appears. And they get into this big time. I mean, here they actually got colored sprays that they're spraying the town. There is a story within Islam that the god Shiva felt sorry for all of the ghosts in the graveyard, that they could not celebrate this festival with the colored powders. So he went into the graveyard and he celebrated it with all the ghosts. And instead, they spread around the different ashes, the cremated ashes from the ghost. And there are sections of India where they keep up this tradition, and they go into where the crematories are, the cremains, and they spread cremains, ashes around to all of the people as well as the colored powders. Well, I'm running out of time here. So let me close here and just remind you to keep calm and wash your hands. And I want to thank you very much for listening to the presentation. And try not to forget that we're going to have part 2 of this talk next Wednesday at 1 p.m. And I will be able to get off the coronavirus subject and talk about a lot of other issues that are happening. So maybe if we have a few minutes left, Stacy can see if we have any questions from anybody that would like to ask anything at this time. I think Stacy's going to turn off the microphones.
Yeah, I'm unmuting everyone. So if you're unmuted, go ahead and ask a question if you have one.
I don't need to listen to everything.
Dave and Marlene are on.
Oh, yes, we are. Dave and Marlene.
Does anybody have a question? No?
Did they say that? How come we can't see?
Yes, I do. Pat. Jack, where do you acquire all your knowledge of this subject, religions throughout the world? Where have you acquired all of your knowledge from?
Oh, it's kind of a little bit of a story here. Oh, it must have been about maybe 10, 15 years ago. I had
Karen.
really bad sore throat. And then I developed a horrible cough. And I wound up coughing throughout the entire night. And I wound up straining my vocal cords. So when I went to the ear, nose, and throat doctor, he says, you're okay, you didn't damage anything, but he says, you cannot speak. If you speak, you'll damage vocal cords. Well, it took about 6 months for my vocal cords to totally heal. So I wasn't able to speak for a long, long periods of time. So I thought, if I'm going to do this, maybe I should catch up on my reading, and I can read about something you're not supposed to speak about. So you're not supposed to talk about politics, right, sex, or religion. So I picked out religion. And so I wound up reading, because I didn't know I was going to not speak for that long, I wound up reading close to like 39 books. I specialized in comparative religion. I read everything out of the local library. I wound up University of Rochester. I went to the Kowiak Divinity School. And so I did all of this reading on it. And then later on, when I was offering classes, someone made an offer for me to teach a class. And I said, I don't have an area of expertise. And then I thought back to, well, I did read all of this other stuff. So that kind of initiated me on reading it. And I have a very large library now of books in comparative religion that I've read and studied.
Well, I'm very impressed, and I thank you very much for having gotten sick and having recovered in your spare time.
Well, thank you very much for attending the class, and I hope to see you all next week.
Thank you, Jack.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Excellent presentation.
Oh.